Eugene Daub is here to share some of his noteworthy works of historical figures and events, and it not only celebrates Eugene's illustrious career, but also the 250th anniversary of America's independence. After the presentation here, we'll go upstairs, and Eugene has his book available, and he will sign it, and this is what it looks like. And there's going to be light refreshments too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's special for me to be able to speak at a library because I probably got the least education of anybody in this room. And so I've tried to make up with it all my life with books. And so, in fact, there's a couple key points in my life that I'll relate to, and probably the first one was when I was about 10 years old. A man gave me a book, and at that point I really didn't know I was an artist, and he gave me this book by William Pogamy, and it's just a wonderful book. You can see it's like the Velveteen Rabbit. You know, it's been used and worn to the point where it has a very special patina. And but anyway, this book I really believe changed my life from that point on, because I just pored over this book, and so there's a couple other times, well, that I'll get to also. I left home at a very early age, around 15, and went on my own, and I became a hairstylist. It was kind of an unusual story, but anyway, I did that to make a living, and this was in the 60s, and bouffants were very popular. You know, the page flip, you may remember, those of you who are as old as I am. But anyway, you know, there were a lot of backcomb involved, very, very full. Hair didn't move. You know, wind could blow, and hair did not move. But anyway, it was a very sculptural medium, and I think I really I think there's a good example here that I make to that, and I'll get back to that later. But one of the first things I wanted to also relate to is El Segundo, because I started to come to El Segundo. See, it would have been 90 in the actually around 80, 89, and I did work for the Mattel Toy Company. I didn't know it at the time, but my future to be wife worked at Mattel also, and she did these. She worked on Barbie. She was a senior designer for Barbie and that sort of thing, and so. But I didn't know any of this yet, because what I was doing was, you know, I'd been a sculptor for some years at that point, but I was doing still a lot of, I hadn't really done, I had only done really one big monument at that point, so I was still doing a lot of things to fill in, and so commercial sculpture was one of the things that helped get me through. So these little heads were for the TV program 90215, was it? 10, yeah, and Luke Perry, and I don't remember his name, but and then I also did an Erte doll, things like that. It was interesting work, and then the other thing that tied me to El Segundo was later in the 2000s, or I think around 2007, I was invited to do the statue of General Schreiber for the Air Force Base, and that was quite a thrill. And at the time, I don't even think they were talking about being the father of the space program, but I'm sure that's what they were thinking about. And so just last year, I did another one for the Air Force Association in Arlington. And this was a smaller version, but they've posed him behind a blast-off, and he's a little bit smaller. And then just to give you an idea how big the first one was, that was the model. And these are done in a foam material. I'll do the model first in like a wet, or rather an oil clay like this. And it's a clay that never dries, so I can work on it every day, for weeks and weeks. And usually I start off with an armature, like these wire, and then I arrange it into the pose. In his case, it was sort of like this kind of a pose, and so I arrange that, and then I put the oil clay on top of that, and I usually make that about 18 to 24 inches. And then once it's approved, then it's scanned, and then that information is put into a milling machine, and then the milling machine carves it in a big piece of foam at whatever size I want it was. So this one was a 9-foot figure, so that's like, higher than that. And so then I go over that full-size foam and I refine it, and then that's what it looks like. You can see it here, and so that gives you some idea how that works. And now this next one, so when it comes from the people who do the milling back to me, I have to then refine it. So this is sort of like what it looks like. That's what the machine has done. So you can see the image is there, and it's at the right size. I don't have to create the whole thing at that size, but I can get this, finish this initial cut, and then I have to go over and I have to sand that off and refine it, and then put a surface of clay back on it, very thin, but it'll look like, just the one that I just showed you. So you're going to see in the next slide what he finally looked like, because that was Harvey Milk. And so that's the final Harvey Milk that's at the City Hall in San Francisco. This is Claude Shannon. And he is the father of, I've heard people say he's the father of IT. I'd never heard of him. So many these amazing people I've never heard of before. But the technology that he invented went toward, creating cell phones and things like that. So he's a big hero with that crowd of people that are into, research, and so I just wanted to put this up here to show you that I haven't gotten that far yet. You can see the armature underneath that I haven't gotten to yet to making the hand. So this is that oil clay that I was talking about. This one is about 8 different locations. It's at Bell Lab, it's at Lucent Technology, University of Michigan, University of San Diego, MIT, Michigan Institute of Technology. Yeah, it's at a bunch of locations. And I didn't know until the piece was done, and then all of a sudden people started coming out of the woodwork and saying, "Hey, we want one of him for our campus too." This was a project for the Bob Hope's tribute to the military in San Diego, and this is one of the small models I was talking about. This is about an 18-inch figure, made from one of those armatures with the oil clay, and that's the full-size enlargement of Bob. And the idea was that he was addressing the troops, and the troops were, I think there were around 15 figures around him in bronze, and they were from all the different military groups, even historically back to the Second World War, when he started to entertain the troops. And so you had everybody from the Tuskegee Airmen, the code talkers and Navajo code talkers, and men and women from every branch of service, all different ranks. And let's see, I think the next one. That's the Tuskegee Airmen here, and then she was a Navy wounded person, and so I did the Bob Hope, and I did half of those figures, and another sculptor, Stephen White, did the other half of the group of people. They had they're in San Diego on I think it's Ocean Drive or Harbor Drive, whatever that main drive is by the water, and it's down toward the convention center, and then it's sort of off the road toward the water a little ways.
Near the Midway.
Yes, right by the Midway, exactly, yeah. Yeah. And this was the original model for it. It didn't turn out quite like that, but over here is where these steps are. And it never did get the map on it. But it's a nice location. And I just end up, you can see he doesn't have a microphone. The microphone keeps getting stolen. So I just had to make a new microphone, 2 new microphones, because they know that one's going to get stolen too. And I just threw this in because this was an old photograph from many, many years ago when I first met Bob Hope. I had done a little medal of him. And so that's what he's showing, a commemorative medal that I had done. And this is getting back to, you know, the Buffon period. Whoops, there. There we go, yeah. That brings back a lot of memories for me. And then, because when I was doing this, I was, basically, I just started to go to art school. And so I was working at night at beauty shops, and I also was moonlighting at funeral homes because I was working in a mortuary and do dead people's hair at night to get myself through art school. And so, yeah. And I think that helped me a lot, that hairdressing, because when I started at the Franklin Mint many years later, my first job in sculpture, one of the first projects I had was doing that sculpture there. So I thought, you know, it's interesting having that hair experience, you know. And so this was really my first job in sculpture was working at the Franklin Mint, and they do mostly historic things, American history typically, but they do some world history too. And this is really a second time that this idea of books came into my life, because what happened was for every project I would do, and this was typical things, it was a series, because collectors love to, you know, have series of medals. And so all these, it was just, every time I would get a one, let's see, this was in Mexico. This was probably my very first one, Franklin and the Free Lending Library. And I thought, well, that's an interesting subject. And the Mint had a library right next to where the sculptors area was. And so I'd go over and hang out in the library and read about all these things that I was doing. And I just got to be a history buff. I loved it. And I couldn't get enough of it. And so I spent as much time in the library as I did in the sculpture department. And so that was just another wonderful experience. And also, let's see, this is Lowell Thomas, I believe. And I didn't do all of these. I did a few of them and did a few of these over. But it was just the history of everything, the history of painters, the history of science, the history of the Olympics. It just went on and on like that. And, you know, there were so many medals that were being done in those days. There were 10 of us, you know, that were doing them and turning all this stuff out.
Did you have to work very small, like?
Well, you know, that's the interesting thing with medals. Unlike with sculpture, where we work small and then enlarge it, with medals, you work large and then reduce it. Because when you're working, you couldn't work at this size. It would just be too difficult. So we usually work at this size. But it starts out as a clay, like that. And then I'll cast this. I'll put a band around it. I'll just put a band around that thing like that, and then I pour plaster into it. And then from that, I get a negative plaster. And that negative looks like, you know, something like that. Now, when I have this negative plaster, now I can do things like carve the letters in. So it'd be very hard to model tiny little letters, but when you're carving in plaster, since it's a hard surface, you get a lot of resistance and you can really make nice crisp lines. And so that's how all the letters get done at that size. And again, that's the reason why it's done large. So they usually start out, first with a sketch, and then from that sketch, once that's approved, then I'll transfer that onto my basin and then start to work in clay. But it's an interesting question because it's the reverse of going large. We're working large and going small.
So how do you reduce it?
The way they reduced it was and I say the old days, this was 40 years ago. Let's see, it was in 75, 74 when I started at the Mint. And in those days, there was no scanning. And so they did it with what they called a Janvier machine, and it was a mechanical process. They would mount the plaster onto this machine, and there was a stylus that went over, that followed, it went like this, and as it was turning, it was going up and down, recording the shape. And then over here, like on a bicycle sprocket, a smaller version of that was a tiny drill, and that was doing this, and it was drilling the information that it felt into the die. And so after about 20 hours it took to record that, you had a finished metal die with that same image of that, only now at this small size. And then they take that die and they put that into a 200,000 pound press, and it comes down and it squashes the material, the bronze. They'll put a little bronze, like a little bronze cookie or a silver cookie, and they put it in, it's a blank they call it, and they'll put that in the machine, and then that press, the die comes down and it just squashes, it forces the metal up into that shape, and that's how coins are made. This is just a few more of the commercial things. This was, what's his name, Shatner, it's a Star Trek guy, and chess players and all kinds of stuff. Little ballet figures, and these were collectible items that were done in porcelain. It was a series of ballet figures. And then when it come to this, one of the wonderful things about the Mint was that they would let all of the sculptors take a class once a week, and we were allowed to pick any class we wanted, and they would pay for it. And so I took a sculpture class. And so I went into Philadelphia, which was close to where the Franklin Mint was. And there was a pretty well-known sculptor. His name was Evangelo Fredakis. And so I studied with him for about eight months, 1 day a week. And that was really my only sculpture training. But he, sort of told us how to set up an armature and talked a little bit about anatomy and composition and all that sort of thing. So that was really my training in sculpture. And then shortly after that, I did my first job, and it was very new. I hadn't really done anything big at that point, but I had twins that were about 10 or 11 years old, and both of them needed braces. And it was like $2,800 or something like that. And I thought, wow, what am I going to do here? And so the dentist, I said, well, the orthodontist, I said, well, is there some way we could do some kind of a barter? And I said, I'll do your family, your wife, your dog, whatever, and for a trade-off. And he said, well, we really don't need anything like that. He said, but came back about a week later, and he said, I have an idea. He said, I'm a deacon at this church, a Paoli Presbyterian church, and he said, we just built a new church, and we have a lunette in our entrance that needs a piece of sculpture. Would you do that? And I said, absolutely. And so the whole idea was, their slogan was, enter to worship, exit to serve. So I chose the Good Samaritan, and so the enter to worship was just a welcoming Christ figure, and then this was the Good Samaritan. And I got stuck on the PowerPoint. I didn't want that to go there, but I couldn't move it, so forgive me for that. And then, right after that, I got my very first commission, and that was in, probably about 1981, something like that. and it was a Christ figure for the Methodist Church in Philadelphia. And so I wanted to do this really the right way, so I hired a model and dressed him in a robe. I actually had I think it was a himation that had to be created, much like what Christ would have worn, or any male person in that period would have worn a garment like this. So that was what was really an amazing experience for me, because I had never really done a figure before, and I had heard about this commission, and I knew the people that were competing for it, and they were pretty well established, and I just was determined that I really needed this commission. So I really didn't wait to be invited. I just went ahead and created a model. And I just thought the only chances I could show it to them and they'll like it. And sure enough, they did, and I got the commission. So that's how it sort of all started. And then I had a huge catastrophe, because when we were making the mold for it, just a group of friends, and the mold failed, and I wasted like 30 gallons of rubber, but it all came out all right in the end, And I'm going to switch right now. I'm going to jump around a little bit if you don't mind. So it's not necessarily in chronological order, but I'll get to the end eventually. So anyway, so this happened around 2000, much later, of course, in 2011 maybe, or something like that. And finally, I think it was unveiled in 2013. But that was just a wonder. This is in the Capitol, and then this is the original clay model that was done. And it was a huge competition. I think there were like 200 entries, and because it was the first time that one of the figures in the Capitol was actually commissioned by Congress. All the other figures in there are donated by the states. Every state can donate two figures to the Capitol. So, nobody had ever done Rosa or donated, so they figured it was about time. So they did a national competition, and that's how Rosa ended up getting done finally. And so that was a great day, And then let's see, and I always love to get these photos. People send me, they'll say, "Oh, I've been in Washington, and this happened and that happened," and they'll show groups of people around, especially when crazy, terrible things are happening. Usually, they all form around Rosa, for some reason. I don't know why. When the armed troops were there, they were all sort of standing around Rosa. And it's great because she gets a lot of coverage that way. And then this was 1990, and I had just moved to Philadelphia, or to California from Philadelphia, and I was working at a studio, and it was close to a foundry in Berkeley, and the Department of the Interior needed to have a sculpture for the island of Guam. They were celebrating the anniversary of one of the things that happened there. But anyway, it was the three sections. This was a giant. It was like about 18 feet wide, and it was the original attack at Guam by the Japanese, and then the occupation, and eventually the liberation. And that's just the first clay. That's why it looks kind of rough. And then the other one was, I never did get final pictures of the bronze because it was after it was installed. But anyway, this was another one. This was the invasion of the various forces, Marines, Army, between 41 and 45. And then this was sort of a more commemorative one, remembering that period. So that was, I haven't really done that many military pieces. But I did have a big run on liturgical sculpture later on again in the mid-90s. And it started out with Apostles. It was the Queen of Apostles Church in somewhere on the coast, San Jose. That's where it was, Queen of Apostles. And so I got to do, I love to do liturgical work, because you really get to invent everybody. And nobody can argue about what St. James looked like. There's just nobody there. And so as long as you get all of the symbols right and the elements, and so, so Philip was the bread and the fish, feeding the masses, and St. James was, with the pilgrim hat and the staff, and the shell was his symbol. And so these were a lot of fun to do. And I developed a technique that I think I invented, but I don't know, who knows. But I had just gotten a slab roller. And a slab roller is this thing where you put a lump of clay and you have a big wheel, and it's like a press. And you can run the clay through, and it makes it into a pizza, sort of like, it makes it all uniform thickness. And then you can take that piece and you can layer it onto, like, let's say you just roughed out a figure, and now, that was part of the problem. I had to sort of get to be familiar with what these garments were like during the period. It wasn't too bad with the apostles, but then I'll get to the next stage. Yeah, these guys, see that sort of thing, and this. So what I did was I ended up buying a roll of polar fleece. Do you know what polar fleece is? They make sweatshirts out of it. It's kind of a synthetic material, but it's kind of thick, I'll come back to that thought. But anyway, this is Simon, I believe. I had a lot of fun with him. And of course, this is, you get to just really, you can be pretty dramatic and just invent poses and things, as long as you keep the symbols right. And that was the original sketch. And then this is the process. So I start out, just on a piece of plywood, and I roughly form it in. And now you can see my little slabs. And here, that was a slab. And of course, this part. So I would just do the head, and then I would take the slab and sort of arrange it into the. And this is I'm working here in what they call wet clay, which is ceramic clay, what they make pots and plates and things like that. And this clay does dry out, so I have to, but I don't fire it. I just use it because I'm working pretty big here, and I want a real malleable clay that I can really manipulate quickly. And then when I'm finished, now this is pretty close to being finished here, and when I'm all done, then I'll have my assistant make a rubber mold of that. And then from that rubber mold, we'll make the final casting. Now this is a hoot. This next one, you're going to laugh. Now, this is St. Eugene over there, and this was my friend Jim Lickeritz from Philadelphia, and he's a sculptor too. And we had a lot of fun posing in these polar fleece because I could get it in big yardage, and I actually made a himation and a toga and different things, because the next set of apostles that I did were fully three-dimensional and wearing this stuff. So this happened to be for a pose of St. John. This is Matthew. I think we're coming to St. John next. No, that's that's Thomas. Thomas. And that's Philip. Or no, Andrew. And the next one, I'm jumping around here a little bit, this is another project that I did that took a lot of time. These were Stations of the Cross for St. Timothy's, I think, in Escondido. And these were done very, very loosely. You can see that it's actually it's a little bit small. The finished one was probably about this big, maybe about 6 foot, something like that. And then I did a couple crucifixes. Well, that was originally done in oil clay, and the size is it's about this big. And then it's cast in a synthetic stone kind of material. It's like a combination between resin and plaster. It's very hard, but you can just kind of paint it into a rubber mold. And so it's not bronze. And then when you get the finished cast, it's just, of course, all one color. And so then I use casein paints to go over it. And the casein paints are a wonderful quality of paint because you can layer it, and then you can burnish it, and it brings the color through. So it almost has a skin-like quality to it. And so the next ones are the Lewis and Clark. And this was really one of my favorite projects. And this came in around the same time, mid-90s. And so I was working on all those religious pieces and this at the same time for probably about 5 years. Because this is pretty big. This thing's about 18 feet high and about 21 feet across. And of course, this is Lewis. And it was just such an amazing story. And I remember running out and getting another book on Ambrose, what's his name? Stephen Ambrose did this wonderful book called Undaunted Courage. And it told the whole journey from beginning to end. So I went steady with that book for a couple of months. And I got a lot of inspiration from it. And so this was based on Jefferson's quote about undaunted courage, and I forget exactly how it went, but that saying wraps around the base, and it's carved in granite on the bottom. And of course, it's got Lewis, Clark, and Clark's slave, York, and Sacagawea. And there's one more figure besides the dog that nobody knows about, and this is the other side of that piece, and that's the figure of York. And Ann and I were in Kansas City several years ago, and while we were looking at it, this young gal starts crawling up, and I said, just wait, that's perfect. I want to take your picture to give a sense of scale to the piece, So she just happened to be an unsuspecting victim. And then this is the head of York. And let's see, okay, second. Oh, so this is the little rider that nobody thinks about. That's Sacagawea's baby. And so it's kind of hard. I mean, you don't see it at all from certain positions. But and then
this subject.
Yes, right. And then this is the model. This is the original full-size model in my studio, and so you can get a sense of, they're about this big here, and they're just cast in resin. And so then what happens, this was actually the first really heroic scale piece that I had done. And it was also the first time I had ever used this new system, which was new, kind of still new in the 90s, of scanning a piece and then having it milled in foam. And it just worked out beautifully because, these were so big in their final way. I actually, at one point, I worked in a factory and I had to get a window rigger's outfit. It was like because it was in a factory and they had an overhead crane. And the only way I could kind of get to these things once they were together was, and I had like an electric box that you could control it, so I could make myself go back and forward and up and down so I could reach, around. It was quite an experience.
About how many hours would it take you to sculpt that?
Oh boy, let's see, hundreds, because, first I had to work it out on a small little scale. Then once that was done, and I had actually tried a couple groupings, and then once I decided on one I liked, then I would do it in what I call maquette size, at about this big, and so yeah, it took a long time. So anyway, after that, a couple years after that, there was a competition in Montana for the Senate chamber needed to have a large plaque to go behind the dais, I think they call it. And so I was invited into competition, and so that was my sketch for the competition. And it showed Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea and York and Seaman the dog, and they would bivouac, and anybody who was familiar with this part of Montana would recognize these cliffs. There was a name for them. So, and we even got to see it at some point later on. But anyway, they're bivouacking, and they're just about either coming in to camp or leaving. It could be either way. And then these were all the symbols, and then the Indian names. And then eventually that all got taken away because everybody got in a fight about which Indian name should be used and not used. So that, and then this was the full-size model, and it's a little disproportionate. There's a lot of distortion going on here. But anyway, this model is made up because they can only cut these pieces of foam, and they only come at certain sizes. So you can see the lines. There's one there, and there's one there, and one somewhere over here, and one there. So it's all put together with these different pieces. And so once that's the full size and large piece, and I go over and carve and work on that. And then after it's done, then it gets to bronze. And they forced us to use a foundry in Montana because they wanted to use Montana labor. I understand that. But it was a very small foundry, and they could only pour like about 100 pounds of bronze at a time because it's limited by the size of the crucible that you could melt bronze in. So the piece was like 52 pieces. It was like a jigsaw puzzle. And of course, when they put it together, it was all wavy. And then they'd have to beat it into shape, and they'd have these huge mallets that they'd just smash it to just push it out, to get it back where it's supposed to be. And then miraculously, all those welds have to be chased and made invisible. It was a huge job, but I have to say, at the end of the day, they did it. And I can't see any places. A little bit, you can see a little bit there and there, and it's mainly from the patina for some reason that you get that discoloration. But, on a very good day, you shouldn't see any of that. But anyway, that kind of gives you a scale for, and so what they went with eventually were animals basically from Montana, and then various sagebrush and bluegrass and various things that grow there. And this was the magpie that was sent back to Jefferson. That was the idea. And that's in the kind of shows the Senate chamber a little bit. And then winning and losing. Okay, well, the reason I did that was because I was just talking to somebody a little earlier about, these are competitions mostly, and it's very painful to lose them because you put a lot of time in these things, and so this one here was one that I put a lot of effort in because I really wanted. This was for the Capitol also, and I didn't win that one, and that was a heartbreak because I really desperately wanted that, and it was kind of a funny story because they didn't want the artist to show anything about aviation. No goggles, no propellers, no anything like that. So you were really stripped of your use of any kind of imagery to enhance, So basically I was trying to get, wind in the air sort of thing, a feeling of lift, maybe a weightlessness. I'm not even sure, but anyway, that was, and then I had done another one the next year. Also, I was a finalist for Norman Borlaug, and there was a young man here a little bit earlier that had a photograph. He had just been to the Capitol last month, and the Borlaug was right next to where Rosa is now. I thought, oh boy, that should have been mine. Anyway, and then this was another heartbreaking thing, and there was a big competition in Oklahoma for a Black History Park. And I was working with a partner at the time, and it involved like 10 acres and about maybe a half a dozen, or no, even more, maybe even 10 or 12 figures, various black people that had, you know, like, there was a black cowboy. Anyway, Charles Hamilton Houston, Frederick Douglass, you know, Martin Luther King, a lot of important people. And so this took probably 4 months to do this proposal, and that one disappeared because the politics changed in the Capitol, and they decided to do a Vietnam memorial instead. So these things happen, you know. So now this one, this is the Lincoln Park hats, and this was really a fun project. And I work with Michael Davis on this, my dear friend and partner, and we just had a great time with this project. And it was basically to commemorate, there's this place in Burbank called Lincoln Park, and the idea was to somehow commemorate this park. And so we were looking for historical things. And so, of course, the namesake was Lincoln Park, so the hat was sort of an obvious one. And but then Michael kicked it up a notch or two and came up with this idea to, you know, create this. And this bench piece here has 77 years ago, right? And so what happens is Michael had this cut out. These are cutouts, and so at certain times of the day, when the sun's shining, it actually projects it on the ground, which is kind of a nice touch. But boy, when the sun's on it, it's just a beautiful thing. It's Corten steel. And this one represented all the people from the agriculture that toiled in the fields, you know, worked under the sun. And we had tiles that were done by Sandal Burke and Lisa, how do you say her last name? Pingley. Lisa Pingley. We did some sketches, and then they turned it into a ceramic painting, and so that was. And then the last one was the Amelia Earhart's, because she flew out of the airport there at Burbank, and so that was a fun project. Yeah. And now the next one was even more fun. They did Guitar Town, I think Gibson Company, for over many years. They did this. They had, on Sunset Strip, they gave out these huge 10-foot guitars to a group of artists, mainly painters. But one year, Anne got to do one. And then I think a couple of years later, then I got to do one. I'm going to show yours too. But anyway, and we also got to pick the entertainer. It had to be an entertainer that used Gibson guitars, of course, you know. So on my list, one of the ones was Blondie, and I'd always had a crush on Deborah Harry, so I really wanted to do this one. And so this material, it had to be outside for a year. So, you know, I couldn't just do clay. So I just did this in paper. It's called ramboard. It's what they put on floors to protect your floors when they're doing construction. And so anyway, it was built out of that. And then I spread Bondo on top of the cardboard, and then painted it with acrylic. And then apparently people were always breaking off the little guitar tuners. And so someone told us that. And so Anne made a necklace out of the tuners, and we just put Blondie on that. And then, of course, this was the Call Me song. And then Chris Stein's name went on the back, but that was just plywood. Anyway, that was a hoot. I really had a good time with that. And then this was Anne's guitar. And of course, she has a crush on Peter Hampton's. So, you know, so she chose his guitar. And this was, what was it? Do You Feel Like I Do? That's right, yeah. Yeah, and that had lots of glitter on it. It was a fun project. And then this next one is one I just did, about 4 years ago, and I had wanted to try something in cardboard. And so this was It's just about that size, maybe even a tiny bit bigger. And so the next section is going to be ceramic clay, because I want to just talk about a lot of materials we use. And so around in '89, I spent a year at Alfred University on a fellowship. And I really needed it because I was doing things, everything was so tight that I was doing, I just needed to loosen up. And so I started making these clay pieces, and it really was a great experience. And then every once in a while I get back to it, and these are hand-built figures. They're made in slabs, and that way I can work inside like you would for a jar, and I can do repoussé, which is the act pushing out. So I can work in and out at the same time. And that's Joe Hill. I don't know if any of you know Joe Hill, the man who never died. He was a Norwegian laborer who ended up in San Pedro and led the laborers who were being abused quite seriously. And anyway, I could talk about him for a long time. But anyway, there's some more. And these are pretty big pieces, and they're all hollow. And so that's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then Anne came up with the idea to put this lace on her, which I just loved. Yeah. And so these are one-of-a-kind pieces. And that was Rachel Carson that I was just working on at the time. And then I want to talk about metals. Now, back in 1982, I had been gone from the Franklin Mint for some time, and I had some friends who had also done similar work, working on metals, and one of them had discovered that in Europe they had this thing that was called art metals, and these were not commemoratives. You know, in the United States, we just had commemorative metals, very kind of serious, stodgy old stuff. But in Europe, they were doing these crazy metals. Artists were just making metals because they wanted to, about anything that they wanted to, in any material, in any size. And so the small group of us formed this organization called the American Medallic Sculpture Association. And we started to participate in these competitions overseas because they had them in a different country every 2 years. So I'm going to show you a couple metals that you probably have never seen metals like this. Anyway, this one was done, it was on the cover of Medalla magazine, which was it's a French metal, and this metal represents dementia. So, I mean, they can be political, they can be personal, that metals can be about anything, they can be any material, they can be any size. Usually they limit it to 6 inches in the competitions, but this is probably about 5 inches. And so, and then this is a metal that I did many years ago. It's a composite. I just used a truck jack for a platen, for a press, and I carved a little image of this male face into a piece of plastic, and then I just took thin pieces of metal and laid them, sandwiched them, and then just came down and pushed that metal into that die. And so, and then I repeated that face, that head, with different materials, you know. So these are a whole different kind of metal. And this one was a porcelain metal. And so I had just modeled the thing originally, and then I made a plaster negative, and then I just took a piece of porcelain, rolled it in a ball, and squashed it into that mold, and that's why the edges are kind of irregular, and then I just put a Celadon glaze on it, and it made it read a little bit better. Now the next one, this is Haim Solomon, who I don't know, has anybody heard of Haim Solomon? Well, he was the guy who financed the Battle of Yorktown. And so he's gotten very popular lately. People are starting to talk about him again. And anyway, I've been doing these medals for the Jewish Hall of Fame for about 15 years. And it's just fabulous because I learn about these amazing characters that I would have never heard about. And so that was the first sketch, and it was just kind of boring. We didn't like it. And so I did another one based on a piece of sculpture of him, and it just seemed to be a little more interesting. And so I'm just going to show you this process. Now that's the clay. That's the clay originally. It's just about big as one of those plasters. And so that's modeled in clay, and then I just carve that in. And then the next thing is to make it, put that collar around it, pour plaster, make a negative, and that's the first negative. And now I put that collar around again and pour a positive. And now we're back to positive again, but I still don't have the dates on here, so I'm going to use that, and now I can carve into the plaster for the dates, and then that was scanned, and then it was 3D printed in a kind of a resinous material at the size that we wanted it. A rubber mold was made, and then resin cast was just poured into that with bronze dust, and that's a final, and it's just about this big. And so they did the whole edition in resin with a bronze dust impregnated into it. So just another way to make a medal. And then the reverse side of it was Washington, because the legend goes that when they had no money for the troops, and they were looking for people to help finance, and somebody said, send for Haim Solomon. and Washington was supposed to have then conveyed that to somebody, send for Haim Washington. So anyway, that's how that, and these were just two different layouts for that. And then that's the final plaster for that size. And then that's the final, these are the computer scans. And so that's the final cast of the reverse side. So now this one is, this one's kind of an interesting thing. Al Nodell, a good friend of mine, who was actually the cause of the book. He's the one that sort of encouraged me and made the book happen, really. I hired a small team, put together, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, he came to me, about 10 years ago. He said, we really need to do a monument to Lewis McAdams, who was a poet in LA, and he became the father of the LA River. And he was a poet, and so one of his famous lines was, if it's not impossible, I'm not interested. And so that went on the front, and so that's how I did it. I first got a piece of plywood, and then I put some foam core, and I carved the foam core. I wanted it to look like it was sort of carved out of the stone, and then I modeled the clay over that. And then the next step, this was the first step, actually. This is the layout, the idea, because his poem was here, and then he had a couple other poems on here, and then I just carved these things in the foam, and then this was the bike path, and then the river was right over there, and then let's see, and then this was the final piece. We put it all together, and then it was cast in cement, and then put together in 4 pieces. So it's just hollow, really, but it kind of has the feeling of a solid piece of, at least I hope that's what the feeling is. And but that was kind of interesting. He said, we have to do this for $30,000. I said, how in the heck are we going to do that? I said, we can't use bronze, can't use hardly anything. Cement's about the only thing that's, cheap enough to do that. So this is the last one, and this is a project that Ann and I did as a team, and this was for the metro station in San Dimas, and we worked on this for several years, and the idea was, at first, Ann had done a beautiful glass illustrations that were going to be in the canopy, but then they standardized the roofs and decided they were all going to be tiled, so unfortunately that never got to happen. But we did do a concept that was called A Sense of Place, and it was about nature and hiking and getting out into the woods, because San Dimas is right on the foothills, and you have these wonderful mountains and lots of nature and animals, and we wanted to just sort of promote that. And so on the bases of these columns, we have these ceramic animals, and there's 7 different animals, and that's the raccoon, yeah. And so they were just setting the tiles in there in this photograph, and then this was the original idea. There would be these giant walking sticks, and at the time we hadn't even thought of carving them. They were just looked like wood, and people could just kind of hang out and lean on them and everything. And then we got the bright idea that, well, geez, they're going to be pretty big. Why don't we just get a lot of information on here? So we had one was animals, all the animals in the area. The other was history. We put history on one, and the other was like was it cultural institutions or something? And then the last one was an adventure stick we had. And let's see, these are the final castings of the plates that go on the bottom. And these are some more of those. And then this is in my studio. This is these are the clay. And this was the adventure stick, and we have Compass and Alice in Wonderland, and there's a cricket up there with his walking stick, and I forget, what were some of the other things that were on? This was your baby, this one here.
Stairs.
Stairs, yeah, different holes in the wood where little creatures were coming. It was a blast. It was pretty funny. Yeah, and so anyway, this is how we built them. We just started out with armature wire, that aluminum wire, and about 4 of them, and then we just arranged them in the shapes, and then wrapped a very thin mesh around that. And then this white stuff is called, it's like a dough. It's a 2-part material. You mix it together. It's like Play-Doh almost. And then you have a couple hours, and it hardens really hard. And so that then wrapped around the mesh, and now we have a nice surface to model on. And so then the next stage is to spread the oil clay on top of that, and then model all the imagery into the clay. And so then here you can see, this one was the animal one, there's a frog and a deer and a buzzard and a possum or something, and this was I think this was that was the adventure one. It had little stairways and different, all about, ships and rockets, and this one was the cultural one. This had the historic, about the history of the citrus industry. And it had, let's see, I'm forgetting with some of it had the history of the railroads, and there was this famous old building that they were very proud of. And so anyway, at this point, these are just about done. They're ready now to go to the foundry. And after they go to the foundry and they get cast in bronze, and these are the final ones being installed. This was the animal one. This was the Experience the Beauty. That was what it was. That one. That was the adventure thing. So it was a fun project.
Very creative.
And I think that's it. My gosh, I got through it. And thank you very much for listening. That was a lot of things. 100 slides. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Yeah.
Thank you again.